Howdy, folks. We're here today at the Kane Conference, the Classical Association of New England Conference, and we noticed a couple of gentlemen dressed very interestingly for this conference. Can you tell us a little bit about yourselves and why you're dressed thusly?
So my name is Andy Volpe. I'm with the Legion reenacting group that's called the Third Legion Cyrenaica. We recreate a Roman legion based in Roman Egypt around the 1st century. And we're also doing a lot of programming with the formerly the Higgins Armory Museum, which is now the Higgins Armory Collection at the Worcester Art Museum in Worcester, Mass. And that's where I got my start, essentially doing these interpretive programs, wearing the equipment and talking about the arms and armor. And we bring all of our equipment to schools and museums and libraries and various other programming. Connecticut State Latin and Greek Day, we presenting at for several years. Massachusetts Classical Day, Virginia Junior Classical League. We had like 2,000 students one year who just do Greek and Latin, and they came to see us. Basically, they had us come down with Legion 20, which is one of our friend groups down in Maryland, and they've done a lot of research and reconstruction. So we're doing both the living history and what's now being called experimental archaeology, making the gear, trying it on, see how it works. What's it like? Is it pinching? Do we have to make adjustments? Or come to find out, it's like, oh, we made this totally wrong. We've got a new artifact that we found, as in the case of the Calcrisa armor of this type that we call today Lorica segmentata. They found one in Calcrisa in Germany where the Teutoburg forest disaster happened in the year 9.
Oh.
And they found they had for a couple of years just this piece of the armor, and it looked different from this variant from a couple of years later. They found an almost complete set of armor that people are actually reconstructing right now and trying to figure out how it gets all put together.
And even with something like that, where you find armor, it still sometimes takes some effort to figure out. With that, they made some mistakes and had it actually backwards. So, the ongoing reconstructive effort is sometimes a trial and error. Part of what we're doing, and one of the things we do, is kind of poke holes at interpretations of, say, rank. A lot of reenactment groups have the two feathers and a central crest as meaning a particular rank, the optio. In fact, they find too many helmets with side plume tubes for that to have been anything to do with rank. I do happen to portray an optio, but they actually had a particular staff, which I didn't bring with me. And actually, a friend who's much more of a Latinist in the Netherlands actually told me how to describe my rank, which in Latin would be optio secundae pili prioris legionis tertii Cyrenaicae.
Ultimate existing. Love it. Wow, that's really amazing when the two of you. What was your name again? I'm sorry.
I am Quinton Johansson.
Wonderful.
I have a Roman name of Marcus Quintius Claus.
Ultimum nomen. I love it. That's so great.
And partly because of these.
Oh, what are
These
these?
are Roman nails, actually from the furthest north. The Romans built a Roman a legionary fortress
Oh, that's incredible.
in Perthshire in Scotland.
Wow.
And they found 11 tons of these, somewhere around 875,000 nails in several pits. Romans being great in burying iron if they were in barbarian territory and they didn't want the Caledones, in this case, to find it. They didn't. And clavi, or clavus singular, also means stripe or nail.
Yep.
So that's where my cognomen comes from.
I love that. I bet the archaeology found those and went, nailed it. So can you tell us a little bit about your garb, specifically the two of you? Because I noticed you said you had the Lorica segmentata, and you seem to be wearing some sort of chainmail garment. Can the two of you talk about your outfits and how they differ and what that represents?
Okay. The Romans were using mail probably around 300, if not earlier, BCE. It was only worn by the wealthiest soldiers.
I can imagine, yeah.
Because it was, and a lot of others. So, and this was worn all the way through the entire Roman period.
Wow.
I mean, we certainly know this armor was already in use by, say, the year 1 and probably earlier. by the time of Caesar, pretty much every legionary soldier is wearing mail. The Celts, the Romans credited the Celts with inventing it. Actually, the Hellenistic armies were also adopting it and using it.
Fascinating.
The Celts were a little later invading Greece, but they very quickly said, that's great armor. It weighs about 30 pounds, so it's heavy. But the belts help take some of the weight. This is dead weight carried in the arms. It's also very heavy if you don't have a belt around it.
Oh, wow. That's
So that redistributes the weight on the hips. So as far as body armor, and then you can.
And I kind of designed my kit to be kind of a generic representation of a kind of a typical regular miles gregarious. Of course, we know this armor today as Lorica segmentata, but that was invented in the 1600s.
Right.
But we see Lorica showing up in the writings. But in either case, this armor, as Quinn mentioned with that those calcresa finds, we're thinking that that's in use for at least 250, maybe 300 years, and it's modular. So the armor that I'm wearing is copied from the Corbridge hoard, which was discovered in the 1960s. It was a big wooden crate with at least 6 sets of this armor. Each section had a different broken part on it. So you got these 4 shoulders, the 2 shoulder assemblies, and the 2 bellies or girdles, as some people call them. And they got leather straps on the inside.
Wow, that's
So
very cool.
Dr. H. Russell Robinson, who discovered the crate and was trying to figure out how this armor, but he went through like 24 variations on how to put this together. And
He was
this is
trying it, works first starting with artwork. And then finding out that the artwork was wrong, and he used some of his expertise. How does this work and actually function?
So if, say, this piece here with the hinge that's broken, if it breaks, what do you do? It's like, well, I ended up riveting it back together. I don't lose any flexibility in the armor. It's very mobile. But I can take off that shoulder assembly and put it in the repair bin.
Yeah.
Grab another one off the shelf and slap it on. At least one of the interpretations of what might be going on. One of the theories.
That makes sense.
And then they find in one of the forts, they find a floorboards or floor on the ground floor. They find metal bits. We find more broken bits of this armor in the archaeological record. So we're thinking they had like assembly line style. So one guy punches out the old rivets, the other guy takes the part and traces out a replacement piece and cuts it out, sheet metal or scraps, pirating parts from other pieces. And then they all start assembling it. So then you have a replacement piece, you put that on the shelf, and you just kind of recycle it around. That's at least one of the ideas that's going on with this, that we think was going on with this armor.
Of course, they could manufacture the whole thing, particularly, say, during the winter months in a fortress.
Sure.
But, even on a site, just finding the broken pieces, this is a very breakable armor.
Sure.
Whereas this can last generations, the mail.
And like we were saying with the living history stuff, that's kind of things we're into. I've been wearing this armor now for over 20 years. When I started in 2002. And the plates are about 16 gauge, which is probably a little bit thicker than the actual. And when I got the armor that was made by a company in India that makes a lot of the gear for reenactors.
Wow.
Sometimes they do okay, and sometimes they're just given plans and they kind of interpret it kind of weird. And we're like, all right. But they made the stuff by hand in the ancient world. You can modify the stuff by hand in the modern world. But anyway, the plates were originally so wide that it was hanging down to my elbows. And I knew that wasn't right.
Right, you know,
Because
mobility,
Matthew
right?
Ramt, with our friend in Legion 20, who's making that calcresa replica, he made replica of the Corbridge. They're very narrow, so I ended up having to cut them down. And that, of course, brought it back up to the shoulders, and that makes a lot more sense.
I also own actually one that was made by Matt Amt, and it ends just above my hips. So it's not long, because that's the other problem. A lot of the ones made in India, they go way down over the hips. And you have to be able to, the Roman soldiers built, especially if you were doing, building your fort in the presence of the enemy, soldiers had to be able to work wearing their armor so that they could immediately, fight if they had to.
So yeah, when I originally weighed it way back when, it was a little over 20 pounds, and shaving off just a little bit of metal brought it to about 18.
Oh, wow.
And again, that's the thinking. It's like, because we used to think it would just hang on your shoulders all day long and be like, oh my gosh, it's so no wonder they cut it off at the hips because it's so much weight. And when I used to wear this years ago, I would slouch a lot, so I actually got spinal compression.
Wow.
I'd have to adjust the mirror in my car, and then have to adjust it the next day because my spine will come back to normal. So you have to learn how to keep your back straight. But also, we're thinking, just like with the mail, you got to put the weight on your hips.
Yes.
So what I'm starting to do now is I've kind of reconsidered, and when I restrapped the inside leather straps a couple years ago, because the leather, of course, wears out, I kind of angled it a little tiny bit, if I could, to try to get it to cinch onto my hips a little bit. And the belts I put on really tightly, and it puts the weight on just on the very tops of my hips, on my waist, my natural waist. And so now it's comfortable. I can wear it basically all day if I want to, though I'll try not to. But
That's really fascinating. I have never thought about the idea that the belt is redistributing the weight from your torso down here so that it can be more evenly distributed. Like,
And
never
it's
once thought of
It's a cool
that.
place to put your swords and have a little decorative piece of decoration. And that's the other thing we run into a lot, is that a lot of reenacting sites, a lot of reenactors still call this a groin guard. This does nothing to protect you. And,
No,
and besides,
this
you got-
is my
you got this
groin
thing-
guard.
you got this thing in the way. So if somebody's getting in my personal area, I'm doing something wrong. So, and that's the thing too. And we only see these on especially tombstone sculptures for about 100 years.
Right.
So we see them around this long around the time of Augustus. If you look on Trajan's column around 110, you actually see images where they actually have the belts wrapped around the belts to shorten them up. And you also have some that have them where they just really have really short drapes, little strappy
Yeah,
things.
by
and
the
then they
end
go
of the
away.
2nd century, they're gone.
Yeah, so they seem to go to the end of the out into the belt with a really long and wrapped around the sides. So yeah, that's one of the things we kind of come around. And of course, the other question is, we represent a legion in Egypt. Did they wear this in the desert? We're not sure.
Right.
And most of the time, the 3rd Legion in particular, there's 2 legions, the Legion 3 and 22nd. From what I've been able to kind of research and trying to figure out, they're mostly manning road stations and watchtowers. So they're basically in a tower doing this. And it's like, hey, Caius, there's a bandit coming up the road. It's like, oh, well, get my armor on. Well, I'll put you 2 denarii if he makes it past the first marker, sort of a thing. And that's what we think is going on, because there's an ostraka, a little pottery shard, kind of like this, just a little representation of I call them tweets. Or maybe I should call them X's now. I'm not
No, I
sure.
like it.
But they have little notes on them. And there's one, when I remember reading about this is a couple years ago. I've been trying to find the actual source because I want to replicate it.
Yeah.
It says, I'm watching workers break rocks all day. It was found near Mons Claudianus, which is one of the major mining operations that the Roman military administrated and guarded. But they weren't, there's not a lot of slave stuff going on necessarily. But in either case, they had all these work areas throughout Egypt, and they had quarters where they find, they were doing pretty well. They had the little vegetable gardens. They had, of course, they have the Nile and all the trade road coming up from the Red Sea. One of my other favorite things to point out, especially with Egypt, is that they find in Berenike, or Berenice, a little horn that's on the Red Sea coast on the Egyptian side. They find a merchant's quarters, and they find a couple of containers of peppercorn.
Wow.
And then, meanwhile, the archaeologists are finding sites in India where they find Roman denarii and some ostraka with Greek on it. And so they're thinking, they know they had international trade at least by the 3rd century AD.
The whole thing with the international trade and his specific mention of pepper is Oberraden, which was a double legion fortress during Augustus's wars in the interior of Germany. They found that the soldiers were consuming pepper that would have been, coming all the way from India.
Wow.
And then under Tiberius, they figured, a couple of Greek mariners figured out how best to use the monsoons and therefore cut out the Yemenis middlemen so that they could do a little more direct trade with India rather than having to make use of the Yemenis as middlemen to, between Indian merchants and Egyptian ports.
Another thing I thought of was that we were talking earlier about the feathers don't mean rank. You notice I'm wearing feathers too, but I represent a regular soldier. Even though I'm currently the commander of the unit, we only have about half a dozen members in the unit. We used to have like 20 at one point years ago, but those numbers have fluctuated as reenacting
them
as
were
the
college
hobby changes.
students and-
Yeah, stuff like that. But I was trying to do this research on the words and stuff. What might have the officers been mentioned or anything. I found the word curator, which to the best of my knowledge, was the guy who was in charge of the watchtower stations and the Presidia, the miniature fortresses that were like the main hub. So we're comparing that with Roman Britain. Of course, we got Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. They had a similar sort of structure. Instead of having a wall, they were just mile stations every mile or a day's walk or whatever. So, but yeah, I only put the feathers on there because it looks cool. Because that's what Romans do. We're fashionistas.
And feathers were very popular with the Italian. You go through the Republic, and there's all kinds of feathers on helmets. And the term curator is similar to speculator, which are job descriptions. They're not an actual rank. It's a description of a job.
Right.
The speculators were involved with prisoner interrogation and stuff like that, or jailers. In both Matthew and Luke, they talk about, they actually, and of course they're spelling Latin words with Greek letters.
Right.
And they actually use the term speculator for the soldier who was charged with executing John the Baptist.
Wow, interesting. That's fascinating. Now, you mentioned things looking cool, and I couldn't help but notice not only are you wearing really cool armor, but you have what looks like a gladius and a pugio. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about those right now. Oh, wow.
Let me grab
Bye-bye.
So we have representations of both. The most commonly seen gladii, we have, of course, the Pompeii, though I think it should be called the Herculaneum, but not a lot of people know where Herculaneum is.
Sure.
I will sit there and say that they also found swords like that in the gladiator barracks in Pompeii.
Yeah,
Wow.
these become pretty popular. And of course, we have the earlier style that's known as a Mainz, found in Mainz, Germany, along the river. So I like to call this Coke bottle or area roll-shaped. And as far as we can tell, they were probably like at the end of Caesar, and then it became pretty popular up until somewhere around Nero or something like that.
Yes.
And then this beak shows up, and as you can see, it's a little bit shorter.
Yeah.
And it's straight-sided, kind of copying the typical Celtic sword that we all know and love.
And some of the speculation is that these were quicker and easier to make, and there was Nero recruited a legion, and then there were a couple of other legions. So they were quick and easy to knock these out.
And they're clunky, too. They're not high quality
and
stuff.
a subset of the Mainz type is what they call a fulham, also similarly a long point, a slightly different shape, and the type find was in Britain and associated, they think, with the invasion of by Claudius.
Wonderful. And let's
Of
take a look at
course,
this
the
pugio.
Pugio,
Yeah.
the infamous Caesar perforator.
That is
because you have the Ide of Mars commemorative coin with the Liberty cap between them, and it's got a depiction where you can see the knobs on the handle on this little tiny coin. So they put that much detail into it. But this is essentially a replica of the find in Exeter, England, which is a pretty popular one, and we have one that has these little brass plates on them too. So that they've got little wooden slips in the middle, but then they're capped with these plates, which likes to collect rust.
And with the strong central rib, the idea is that probably these were perfect for using against an armored soldier wearing mail, because this
Right.
this would break apart the joined rings.
And it's so thin, like that.
And this is also, everybody, or people have heard the term gladius hispaniensis, which was the Spanish sword. These are thought to have also been developed in Spain and adopted. These were not a part of regular issue equipment, and you get a lot of variation in them. This would have been more something that a soldier might be personally acquired equipment. We do know of a cavalryman who actually, when he needed to put up collateral for a small loan, put his pugio up, so he must have had silver inlaid on it. Some of them are very highly decorated.
Wow. We've seen a couple of times where people, modern reenactors and things, they think that they could use a dagger as a backup, kind of like rapier and dagger, but we only see that in the Renaissance, because there's no hilt there to protect my hand from getting sliced. So.
Sure.
And Romans do like to stab, and that's what a rapier is kind of intended for. But again, that's 1500s, 1600s. That's a little bit beyond our period.
And the idea of a uniform with the Romans doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that's
And what we do have is, and I think it's in Tacitus, the discussion during when Carballo was governor in Germany, and he was a martinet of a disciplinarian, found some soldiers who were doing work, and they were unarmored and stuff like that, and one of them at least was not wearing his belts, and he was punished for that. But Carballo, of course, had no sense of humor, and he came by another time, and that same soldier was not wearing any clothes at all except his belts. And of course, Carballo then said, "I'm done with you, you know, execute him." And of course, as a provincial governor, he had the power of jus gladii, which meant you could execute a soldier,
Yeah.
a citizen soldier. The idea of a uniform just doesn't exist in pre-modern armies.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
And
so
what's this?
we're only wearing red tunics today. Just my white one wore out after wearing it for like a couple of years, and so this is my backup, because we find evidence of red and white tunics, but we have no context of which was which. So this is a photocopy of a fine portrait that's at the Worcester Art Museum, and dated somewhere around the 3rd century.
Yeah.
And as you can see, he's got scraggly hair, he's got a beard, and he's got a white tunic with black or some other color that might have faded, probably blue stripes, the clavi. There's another portrait, I'm meaning to get a photo of that as well, right next to him in the display with the Monte Fortuna helmet, which is also cool. He's blonde, clean shaven, with a red tunic with dark blue stripes.
Wow.
So again, we have no context, because in the 1700s, these collectors, the antiquarians, they just pulled the masks off the sarcophagi to collect them, and they ground up the mummies into elixirs and stuff.
Yes.
You do see clavi showing up more on tunics in the 2nd century. Of course, we've got the caves that were associated with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and they have found tunics in there. They've got clavi. So they had become clearly something more than just, for instance, what we're familiar with the glotticlavus or the Augusti clavi for the senatorial and equestrian officers. Those terms actually refer to the stripes, the broad stripe tribunes and the narrow stripe tribunes. The other interesting thing that's different about the legions in Egypt was you don't have senatorial officers at all. All 6 of your tribunes are equestrians. The legion's commanded by an equestrian prefect. The governor of the province is an equestrian prefect.
Wow.
Well, you mentioned that they probably had the silver from Spain, right? It was a pugio.
Bugio inlaid with silver was what they mentioned.
Yes, yes. And Andrew went to Spain. No, it wasn't the last year; it was the year before, I think. And he went to Toledo.
Yes.
Which existed. It's still very
Toletum.
popular. It's still very popular for the silver products, and you made a video there. But that also did exist during that time. So that always makes me think of that area and how that's when they started using silver more in their weapons.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you both, Andy, Quentin, for speaking us today. Like, you have a captive audience. But what we want to do also is tell our listeners, our followers, where they can find you and how they can learn more about you or call them to your school, whatever it might be. How can we do that?
We're on Facebook. If you look up Legion III Cyrenaica, which is Cyrenaica.
We'll put a link.
And you can put it in. I'll definitely, guys, give you a link. We're also on the Instagram, and we also have a Gmail email. You can email us, and you can get in contact with us.
Great. What's
And,
your
we
email?
cover New England, basically.
Okay, fantastic.
And we have members throughout all the New England states. We go to a couple events, including the Worcester Art Museum and other timeline events with other units and other time periods too.
There's the two of us are the primary presenters. We've got a third member who actually represents Signifer. He actually has a signum,
Wow.
an aquila, and also a vexillum, all for the.
And
And he
scale.
also does some archery stuff, and he wears actually a third type of armor, which is scale.
Wow.
That is brilliant. Thank you both so much for your time and for talking to us. Folks, follow the link in the description and get them to an area near you because they have so much knowledge to share. Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Awesome.